Mark. And I too want to thank everyone for taking the time to be here today. There are several key U.S. trade laws that provide for the imposition of tariffs or other trade restrictions or remedies. They include the anti-dumping and countervailing duty laws, Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962, Section 201 of the Trade Act of 1974, and Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974. These laws reflect Congress's recognition over the years that as we were engaged in efforts to expand or liberalize trade, we needed tools to prevent imports from harming the U.S. economy or national security, and to ensure that freer trade did not lead to U.S. workers and businesses being harmed by a flood of imports. The fact is that support for greater trade was predicated on having these backstops or safety valves. The laws serve different purposes, have different standards and considerations that come into play, and may involve different types of remedies. They also have important differences in whether relief is mandatory or discretionary, even when the requirements of the law are satisfied. The anti-dumping and countervailing duty laws are the most frequently used trade remedies, and they've been around in the United States for roughly 100 years. They are extensively employed not just by the United States, but by countries around the world as a safety valve to provide relief against imports that are unfairly traded and that they are being sold at unfairly low or dumped prices, or benefit from unfair government subsidies, and they are causing or threatening injury to a U.S. industry. In the United States, they are administered by two agencies, the Department of Commerce and the International Trade Commission. And they involve analyses of extensive sales, costs, and other data, and the use of detailed technical calculations to measure the actual margins of unfair trade. The relief takes the form of duties on imports of specific products from a specific country or countries based on the margins of unfair trade, and the duties may be adjusted over time, and very often are, to reflect the actual margin of unfair trade. So this is really targeted relief focused on imports that have been found to be traded unfairly. If the legal requirements are satisfied for these types of remedies, relief is not left to the president's discretion, it is mandatory. The other trade laws that I'll talk about have also been in place for around 50 years or more. However, these laws were largely dormant, for 15 to 20 years before taking on greater prominence starting in 2017. They were there, but they simply were not being used. Section 232 was originally enacted in 1955 as part of the laws intended to liberalize trade. Again, Congress did not consider the protection of domestic industries that were important to the national security to be in any way inconsistent with trade liberalization. Section 232 allows the president to take action to adjust imports if the Department of Commerce finds that products are being imported into the United States in such quantities or under such circumstances as to threaten to impair U.S. national security. There are a number of factors that Commerce has to consider in reaching this determination relating to the requirements of the defense and essential civilian sectors and how imports have impacted and will impact the domestic industry and its ability to meet those requirements. Commerce and the president are also required to recognize the close relation of the economic welfare of the country to our national security in these cases. There's no requirement as part of Section 232 to show unfair trade practices. Now, as part of these cases, Commerce issues a report with its determination and recommendations for action, if any, within 270 days. However, it is the president who has ultimate discretion to decide whether to accept Commerce's determination and to decide what, if any, action to take. There is no set duration for Section 232 measures, and they can be terminated or modified at any time. Prior to the Trump administration, there were a limited number of Section 232 investigations, with the last one in 2001, and there were even fewer actions taken under that statute. That all changed in 2017, and there have been several 232 investigations since then. The one that many people, of course, are familiar with is the Section 232 investigations involving steel and aluminum that were brought to address the massive volumes of steel and aluminum that were flooding the world market and into the United States, and that were threatening the viability of the U.S. steel and aluminum industries. Those cases resulted in affirmative determinations and the imposition of tariffs of 25% on steel and 10% on aluminum, with certain countries having quotas imposed. Now, some of that relief has now been modified and into tariff rate quotas, and we currently have tariff rate quotas on the EU, Japan, and the UK. Now, with respect to the other Section 232 investigations, they largely did not result in tariffs or other import restrictions, but involved other relief being granted to the domestic industry. So there were cases on autos and auto parts, uranium, titanium sponge, laminations and cores used in power transformers, vanadium, and most recently on rare earth magnets, which was a Biden administration action. Section 201 developed from escape clause provisions that the United States began including in trade agreements in the 1940s to provide temporary relief to an industry suffering serious injury from imports. As a result, these investigations are sometimes called global safeguard or escape clause investigations. Section 201 provides for relief to limit surges in imports that are a substantial cause of serious injury to a domestic industry, and it's intended to provide the industry with an opportunity to adjust to increased competition from imports. Unlike the anti-dumping and countervailing duty laws, there is no requirement under Section 201 to show unfair trade. Section 201 cases also are not limited to goods from a particular country or group of countries. They apply globally. The relief can take the form of tariffs, quotas, tariff rate quotas, agreements with other countries to limit exports, or any combination of these. In these cases, the ITC conducts the investigation and makes recommendations, but once again, it's the president that has ultimate discretion to decide whether to grant relief, and if so, in what form and amount. If the president does not accept the ITC's recommendations or opts to take no action, the House and the Senate can override that decision by joint resolution of disapproval within 90 days. In exercising his discretion, the president must consider the economic and social costs of the action as opposed to the potential benefits. The president also has to weigh U.S. national economic and security interests, including the possible impact on consumers and other industries. Now, the relief under Section 201 is temporary. It only applies for a limited amount of time, up to 4 years, subject to a limited extension. And any relief exceeding 1 year has to be phased down over time. The ITC conducted 73 Section 201 investigations from 1975 to 2001, but relief was only granted in 26 of those cases, with the last action before the Trump administration being the steel Section 201 investigation in 2001. There have been 3 recent safeguard investigations. One on washers, which resulted in relief initially for 3 years. That was subsequently extended to another 2 years, but expired earlier this year. There also was a case on solar cells and modules, which also resulted in an affirmative determination and relief initially for 4 years. That now has been extended for an additional 4 years, so that will expire in 2026. And there was also a case on blueberries, but that resulted in a negative determination by the ITC. Finally, Section 301 allows action if USTR determines that there is an act, policy, or practice of a foreign government that denies the rights of the United States under any trade agreement, or is unjustifiable and burdens or restricts U.S. commerce, or is unreasonable or discriminatory and burdens or restricts U.S. commerce. Where this is the case, the president can take all appropriate and feasible action to counteract that act, policy, or practice, including placing tariffs and restrictions on imported products. This provision was used several times in the 1980s as an enforcement mechanism that gave teeth to our trade negotiations. For example, it was used as leverage to negotiate voluntary restraint agreements on steel. It was also used by the Clinton administration as leverage in negotiations with Japan on autos trade. But because the U.S. used it so effectively, our trading partners pushed hard to weaken it, and they were successful in putting limitations on Section 301 as part of the Uruguay round trade agreements that led to the establishment of the WTO. The implementing bill enacted by Congress for the Uruguay round agreements in 1994 stated that if a trade agreement violation was found using Section 301, the only remedy was to bring an enforcement action at the WTO. So after the Uruguay round, Section 301 was used primarily to encourage USTR to bring WTO litigation. However, there was still one very important area where Section 301 could be used without going to the WTO. If USTR determines that an unreasonable or discriminatory act, policy, or practice is not a violation of a trade agreement, then the president can take action to induce the foreign country to stop the practice, again, including through raising tariffs and restricting access to our market. So beginning in 2017, there was a revitalization of Section 301 as a tool to combat unfair trade practices using this authority. And there were 6 Section 301 investigations that were conducted from 2017 to 2020. One that I think many people are familiar with involved China's theft of technology, cyber intrusions, and failure to protect intellectual property. That resulted in 25% tariffs being imposed on $200 billion worth of Chinese imports and 7.5% tariffs on an additional $120 billion of Chinese imports. There were also Section 301 investigations of the EU's aircraft subsidies that arose out of a WTO case. There were cases on digital services taxes imposed by France and 10 other jurisdictions. And then there were 301 investigations on Vietnam's illegal timber harvesting practices and on Vietnam's currency undervaluation practices. So Section 301 became a more active tool since 2017, and the tariffs on China, of course, remain in effect at this point. So 301 is very much an active tool that can be used by any administration at this point. So well, that, Mark, concludes my presentation. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Mark, you're on mute if you want to unmute.
Thank you, Tom. Jeff, as I was saying, we've got multiple questions. And what I'd like to do is start with the first one that's been submitted, and then we'll go through the list as far as we can get with the time that we have left, okay? The first one, it says, recognizing the discretionary nature of certain trade remedies, is there a place for a public interest test before imposing tariffs?
Thanks, Mark. So as I mentioned, relief under sections 232, 201, and 301 is subject to the ultimate discretion of the president on whether to grant relief, and if so, in what form. In exercising that discretion, the president does weigh different economic and national security interests. In particular, section 201 specifically provides for the president to consider potential effects on U.S. consumers and other U.S. industries. And this makes perfect sense in the context of those cases, because the relief is global in scope. It often impacts a broader range of products, and there has not been a finding that the imports are unfairly traded. Contrast that with anti-dumping and countervailing duty cases where a public interest test makes no sense. These cases provide targeted relief on a specific product from a specific country or group of countries, and the agencies have determined that the imports are unfairly traded. And there's been a policy decision made by the United States for decades that we are not going to prioritize the short-term interests of certain entities in buying unfairly low-priced, dumped, and subsidized goods that are harming a U.S. industry, and it could lead to that industry being wiped out with the long-term implications that would have. Public interest tests would also politicize anti-dumping and countervailing duty cases. These cases involve detailed technical analyses and calculations to determine the actual margin of unfair trade and the injury to the U.S. industry under the requirements of the statute. And you would be injecting a highly subjective and political element into this process that simply does not belong. It would also make the cases far more expensive at the worst possible time when an industry and workers are suffering. These cases are already too expensive for companies and workers to bring. They don't need to be made more expensive.
Thank you. The second question, which was submitted, says, can you please explain how unions fit into the process of bringing a trade case? Unions
can and do have an important role in trade cases. They are interested parties that can file trade cases under these laws, and they can serve as petitioners either with companies in the industry or on their own. In fact, we filed a new anti-dumping case just 3 weeks ago on truck and bus tires from Thailand, in which the union, the USW, is the sole petitioner in that case. Unions also can be and are actively involved in the litigation of the case through providing testimony, submitting data and other evidence in the case, and filing briefs. So they do have a very active role in the cases.
Well, it looks like we got a couple minutes left. So why don't I hit you with the last question that had been submitted to us, which are, what are the type of benefits typically arising from a trade case for a company's workers?
There are really a number of important benefits for workers from a trade case. Typically, when an industry is injured by a surge of imports, the companies have to idle or shut down plants and lay off workers. A successful trade case can allow them to reopen facilities and bring back laid off workers. It can also allow them to make investments so they can hire even additional workers. And the cases often lead to improved financial and other performance for the companies involved. And so that can allow them to provide increased wages for workers, better health care coverage, and strengthen retirement benefits. So there are just a range of really important benefits, I think, that workers get from as a result of these trade cases.